Tennessee cold case from 2011 was finally solved, and the arrest shocked an entire community. On the quiet morning of April 13th, 20-year-old Holly Lynn Bobo stepped out of her family home in Parsons, Tennessee, preparing for another day of nursing classes. Her brother Clint from the window as she walked toward the carport with a man in camouflage clothing. He assumed it was her boyfriend. He was wrong. Within minutes, Holly vanished into the woods behind their house, leaving behind only silence and a family's worst nightmare. For 3 long years, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation chased shadows while the Bobo family clung to hope. Hundreds of neighbors searched fields and creeks. Churches held prayer vigils, but Holly never came home. Then in 2014, authorities announced arrests that sent shockwaves through the small town. Local men, people they knew, people they trusted, had taken one of their own. But why did it take so long to uncover a truth hiding in plain sight? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning air carried the scent of dew and possibility as Holly Lynn Bobo moved quietly through her family's modest home in Parsons, Tennessee. April 13, 2011 had dawned clear and bright. The kind of spring day that made 20-year-olds dream of summer adventures ahead. Holly's nursing textbook lay open on the kitchen counter, filled with highlighted passages and careful notes in her neat handwriting. She had always been disciplined about her studies, driven by a genuine desire to help others heal. Her parents, Dana and Marie Bobo, had left early for work, trusting their daughter's routine. Holly would drive herself to nursing school at the Tennessee Technology Center in Hohenwald, just as she had done countless times before. The house felt peaceful in those quiet moments before the world woke up, filled with the ordinary sounds of coffee, brewing, and morning news playing softly on the television. Clint Bobo, Holly's protective older brother, watched from his bedroom window as his sister gathered her things in the carport. Nothing seemed unusual about the morning until he noticed a figure in camouflage clothing approaching Holly. The man appeared to be leading her toward the woods that bordered their property. Clint assumed it was Drew Scott, Holly's boyfriend, perhaps surprising her before classes. The couple often spent time together outdoors, and Drew was known to wear hunting gear. But something felt wrong. Holly's body language seemed different. Tense, uncertain, Clint rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the figures had already disappeared into the treine. The silence that followed would haunt him for years to come. His sister never returned from those woods. The minutes stretched like hours as Clint waited for the familiar sound of Holly's car starting in the driveway. Her cell phone sat on the kitchen counter, abandoned in her rush, but he tried calling anyway. The voicemail greeting played Holly's cheerful voice, promising to return calls soon. Each unanswered ring felt like a small defeat. When 30 minutes passed without any sign of Holly, Clint's unease transformed into genuine worry. His sister was never late for school, never failed to say goodbye. The woods beyond their backyard had always been a place of childhood adventures and family hunting trips, but now they seemed to hold darker possibilities. He tried Drew Scott's number, hoping to confirm that his sister was safe with her boyfriend. But Drew answered on the first ring, confusion clear in his voice. He hadn't seen Holly that morning. He wasn't wearing camouflage. He wasn't anywhere near the Bobo house. The realization hit like a physical blow. If the man with Holly wasn't Drew, then who was he? And where was Holly now? Clint's hands shook as he dialed his parents' numbers, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound crazy or panicked. But how do you explain that your sister has vanished with a stranger? How do you admit that you watched it happen and did nothing? Marie Bobo's voice cracked through the phone when Clint explained what he had witnessed. Within minutes, both parents were racing home, their workdays forgotten. The family gathered in the kitchen where Holly's textbook still lay open, coffee still warm in the pot she had poured. At 8:42 a.m., Dana Bobo made the call that would change everything. His voice was steady but strained as he reported his daughter missing to 911. The dispatcher's routine questions felt surreal against the backdrop of their growing panic. When was she last seen? What was she wearing? Did she leave voluntarily? By mid-morning, the Bobo property had transformed into something unrecognizable. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the yard like caution ribbons fluttering in the breeze that had seemed so gentle just hours before. The tape marked more than a boundary. It marked the moment when their quiet life ended and their nightmare began. DeKalb County Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed quickly by Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents. Their vehicles lined the normally empty country road, drawing curious neighbors who had never seen such commotion in their peaceful community. The sight of law enforcement taking over the Bobo yard made Holly's disappearance feel terrifyingly real. Investigators moved with practiced efficiency, photographing the carport where Holly was last seen, collecting any evidence that might explain what happened. They found her purse inside the house, her car keys on the counter, her nursing uniform laid out for the day ahead. Everything suggested she had planned to return home that evening. Word spread through Parsons with the speed that only small towns can achieve. Church phone trees activated. Neighbors called neighbors. Within hours, the community mobilized in a way that would have made Holly proud. She had always believed in the power of people coming together, and now they were coming together for her. As the sun began to set on that first terrible day, an impromptu prayer circle formed in the Bobo yard. Marie stood in the center, her face streaked with tears, but her voice strong as she led the group in prayer for Holly's safe return. The circle grew larger as more neighbors arrived, their presence a physical reminder that the family wasn't alone in their anguish. The yellow tape fluttered in the evening breeze, a stark reminder that normal had been shattered. But the circle of clasped hands and bowed heads offered something else: hope. As darkness fell over Parsons, that hope was all they had to hold on to. The next 48 hours brought an overwhelming response that demonstrated the best of small-town America. News of Holly's disappearance spread beyond Parsons, reaching Nashville television stations and drawing volunteers from across Tennessee. The search grid map posted at the command center showed the methodical approach investigators were taking, dividing the vast woods and farmland into manageable sections. Hundreds of volunteers arrived with boots, backpacks, and determination. Farmers brought ATVs and horses. Local hunters offered their knowledge of the terrain. Church groups provided food and water stations. The Bobo family watched in amazement as their community and complete strangers dropped everything to search for Holly. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation coordinated the massive effort from a command post set up in the parking lot of New Hope Baptist Church. Search teams worked in rotating shifts, combing through dense underbrush, checking abandoned buildings, following creek beds and hunting paths. Helicopters circled overhead while tracking dogs followed scent trails that seemed to vanish at the road. Every few hours brought a surge of hope. A piece of clothing spotted in the distance, a possible witness coming forward, a new lead to investigate. But each lead dissolved under scrutiny, leaving searchers to venture deeper into the wilderness that surrounded Parsons. The woods seemed endless, full of places where someone could hide or be hidden. Marie and Dana Bobo took turns staying at the command post, greeting volunteers and providing any information that might help. They described Holly's habits, her favorite places, her fears. They shared photographs and answered the same questions repeatedly, clinging to the belief that the next search team might bring their daughter home. As the second day ended, exhaustion began to show on every face. Volunteers who had arrived full of energy now moved with the careful steps of people who had walked miles through difficult terrain. The initial adrenaline was fading, replaced by the sobering realization that finding Holly might take much longer than anyone had hoped. 1 week after Holly's disappearance, Parsons found itself under siege by news media from across the region. The satellite dish on the news van became a familiar sight in the church parking lot, its technology feeling alien against the backdrop of rural Tennessee. Reporters conducted stand-up broadcasts against the picturesque scenery, their polished presentations a stark contrast to the raw grief consuming the community. The media attention brought both benefits and complications. Holly's story reached millions of people, generating tips from across the country, but it also brought unwanted scrutiny and wild speculation. Internet forums buzzed with amateur theories. Social media users analyzed every photograph and video, looking for clues that might have been missed. Local residents found themselves reluctant celebrities approached by reporters seeking quotes about Holly and her family. Most declined to speak, protecting their neighbors' privacy during an already difficult time. But the cameras and microphones were constant reminders that their small town had become the center of a mystery that captivated far more people than they had ever imagined. The speculation was particularly hard on Holly's family. Every theory, no matter how far-fetched, felt like another assault on their daughter's memory. Some suggested she had run away voluntarily. Others pointed to various local men as potential suspects. The theories multiplied faster than investigators could address them. creating a fog of rumors that sometimes obscured the actual facts of the case. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents held regular press conferences, pleading for patience while they followed leads methodically. They urged people to report information to law enforcement rather than spreading unconfirmed rumors. The agents' professional demeanor provided some stability in a situation that felt increasingly chaotic. As the media circus continued, the investigators worked quietly in the background, building their case with the careful precision that successful prosecutions required. They knew that public attention could be both helpful and harmful, and they struggled to balance transparency with the need to protect their investigation. 2 weeks into the ordeal, the Bobo family faced their most difficult challenge yet, speaking publicly about Holly. While investigators continued their work, the family had always been private people, more comfortable with quiet faith than public attention, but they understood that keeping Holly's story in the news might be the key to bringing her home. The church support banner hanging in the sanctuary of New Hope Baptist Church had become a gathering point for the community's prayers and hopes. Marie Bobo often stood before it during the evening prayer services, drawing strength from the knowledge that hundreds of people were lifting their family up in prayer. The banner painted by the church's children showed Holly's photograph surrounded by colorful hearts and messages of love. Dana struggled with the interviews more than his wife. His pain was evident in every word, but he forced himself to speak because he believed it might help find Holly. He talked about his daughter's dreams of becoming a nurse, her kindness to others, her love for her family. Each interview reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Clint carried a different burden. The guilt of that final moment, watching Holly walk into the woods with a stranger, consumed him. He replayed the scene endlessly, wondering what might have happened if he had acted differently. His parents reassured him that he couldn't have known, but the weight of survivor's guilt settled heavily on his shoulders. The family's church rallied around them with the fierce protectiveness that small congregations can provide. Members took turns bringing meals, handling phone calls, and shielding the Bobos from well-meaning but overwhelming visitors. The church became their refuge, a place where they could grieve openly without feeling watched or judged. Late at night, when the reporters had gone home and the house was quiet, Marie would often retreat to Holly's room. She would sit on the bed, surrounded by her daughter's things, and weep for the future that seemed to be slipping away with each passing day. As summer arrived in Parsons, the initial urgency of Holly's disappearance began to fade into a different kind of suffering. The long, slow torture of unanswered questions. The massive search efforts had been scaled back. Though dedicated volunteers still combed remote areas on weekends, the media had largely moved on to other stories, leaving the family to face their grief without the distraction of constant interviews. The empty place setting at the Bobo dinner table had become a symbol of hope that refused to die. Each evening, Marie carefully arranged Holly's favorite plate and silverware, maintaining the routine as if her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. The gesture was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to a mother's love that transcended logic. Friends and neighbors tried to convince Marie to put the setting away, arguing that it made healing more difficult, but she refused, explaining that hope was all she had left. If she stopped setting Holly's place, it would feel like giving up on her daughter's return, and Marie Bobo was not ready to give up. The summer passed in a haze of sleepless nights and difficult days. Dana threw himself into work, seeking distraction in physical labor that left him too exhausted to think. Clint struggled with depression and anxiety, haunted by nightmares about that April morning. The family attended counseling together, but the sessions often ended with more tears than answers. The community continued to support them, but the initial intensity had naturally diminished. People had their own lives to live, their own problems to solve. The Bobos understood this and never complained, but the gradual return to normalcy around them emphasized how abnormal their lives had become. Investigation updates became less frequent as leads dried up. The TBI agents remained committed, but they had to balance Holly's case with other active investigations. The family tried to be patient, understanding the complexity of the work, but each day without progress felt like another step away from the truth. The calendar pages turned relentlessly, marking time in a way that felt both meaningless and painful. 2012 arrived without Holly. Then 2013, each milestone her birthday, Christmas. The anniversary of her disappearance brought fresh waves of grief and renewed pleas for information. The community found ways to honor Holly's memory while struggling with their own sense of helplessness. Memorial Christmas ornaments bearing Holly's photograph appeared on trees throughout Parsons. Local businesses displayed her picture in their windows. An annual scholarship was established in her name at the nursing program she had loved. These gestures helped keep her memory alive while providing some comfort to her family. The investigators never stopped working the case, but their efforts became less visible to the public. They re-entered witnesses, re-examined evidence, and followed up on tips that continued to trickle in from across the country. Each new lead required careful investigation, consuming time and resources without guaranteeing results. Marie Bobo became an advocate for other missing persons' families. Using her painful experience to help others navigate similar orals, she testified before the state legislature about the need for faster response protocols and better coordination between agencies. Her advocacy work gave her a sense of purpose while honoring Holly's memory. The family learned to live with uncertainty in ways they never could have imagined. They celebrated holidays and milestones, but always with an awareness of who was missing. They found joy in small moments, but it was joy tinged with sorrow. They discovered reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed, drawing on faith that seemed tested beyond endurance. As another Christmas approached without Holly, the family clung to the belief that answers would eventually come. They had to believe that someone somewhere knew what had happened to their daughter. They had to believe that truth, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. Without that belief, the darkness would have been unbearable. February 2014 brought the phone call that the Bobo family had been praying for and dreading for nearly 3 years. The arrest warrant for Zachary Adams represented the first concrete development in Holly's case since the initial investigation began. TBI agents had been building their case quietly, following leads and gathering evidence with the methodical patience that major cases required. The name Zachary Adams was not unfamiliar in Parsons. He was known as a troubled man with a history of violence and drug-related crimes. Some residents had whispered his name in connection with Holly's disappearance from the beginning, but speculation was far different from having enough evidence to make an arrest. The announcement that he had been formally charged sent shockwaves through the community. Marie Bobo's reaction to the news was complex. Relief that progress was finally being made mixed with terror about what the arrest might mean for Holly. If Zachary Adams was responsible for her daughter's disappearance, then the worst fears about Holly's fate were likely true. But at least there would finally be answers and perhaps justice. The arrest dominated local news coverage, bringing the media circus back to Parsons with renewed intensity. Reporters who had moved on to other stories returned, seeking interviews with anyone who knew Adams or could provide insight into his connection to Holly. The community found itself once again under scrutiny, but this time there was a sense of progress rather than helpless waiting. Adams was held without bond, charged with especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated murder. The charges suggested that investigators believed Holly was dead, though her body had not been found. For the family, this official acknowledgement of their worst fears was both devastating and oddly relieving. The uncertainty had been torture. Knowing the truth, however painful, allowed them to begin a different kind of grieving. The town buzzed with conversations about Adams and his possible motives. People who had known him shared stories about his violent behavior and drug use. Others expressed shock that someone from their community could be capable of such evil. Spring 2014 brought additional arrests that expanded the scope of the case beyond anything the community had imagined. When investigators announced that Dylan Adams, Zachary's cousin, and Jason Autry had also been taken into custody, the magnitude of the conspiracy became clear. The mug-shot photos of all 3 suspects displayed side by side on news broadcasts showed faces that some residents recognized from around town. The revelation that multiple local men were allegedly involved in Holly's disappearance and murder shattered the community's sense of security in a new way. It was one thing to believe that a single disturbed individual had committed this crime. It was quite another to realize that several people had participated and kept the secret for years. Dylan Adams was known as Zachary's weaker cousin, someone who followed rather than led. Jason Autry had a reputation as a small-time criminal and drug dealer, a man who lived on the edges of respectable society. Together, they represented the darker underbelly that existed even in small towns like Parsons, hidden beneath the surface of church suppers and high school football games. The media frenzy intensified with each new arrest, bringing national attention to the case. Cable news programs featured expert panels discussing the evidence and the legal strategies that might unfold. Holly's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk in seemingly safe communities. For Marie Bobo, the expansion of the case brought both hope and despair. Hope that multiple arrests meant investigators had strong evidence. Despair that more people had been involved in harming her daughter. The knowledge that several men had conspired together made Holly's ordeal seem even more horrific. The family attended each court hearing, sitting quietly in the gallery as legal proceedings unfolded. They watched the defendants with a mixture of hatred and curiosity, trying to understand what had motivated these men to destroy their family. The legal process would be long and difficult, but it represented their best chance for justice and answers. Marie whispered prayers during each hearing, asking God for strength to endure whatever revelations might come. She knew that learning the truth about Holly's final hours would be painful beyond imagination, but not knowing had been worse. Summer 2014 brought disturbing details to light as prosecutors began sharing their evidence with defense attorneys in the court. The sealed evidence boxes that investigators had been filling for years contained statements, forensic findings, and other materials that painted a horrific picture of Holly's final hours. While many details remained sealed to protect the ongoing legal proceedings, enough information leaked out to generate public outrage. The community learned that investigators believed Holly had been held captive for hours before being killed. The evidence suggested that she had fought bravely against her attackers, maintaining her dignity and courage, even in unimaginable circumstances. These details were both heartbreaking and inspiring, showing that Holly's character had remained intact even in her darkest moments. Public anger toward the defendants grew as more information emerged. Some residents called for vigilante justice, though community leaders urged people to trust the legal system. The men accused of killing Holly had to be moved to secure facilities for their own protection. As threats against them multiplied, the evidence also revealed the extensive efforts investigators had made to solve the case. They had conducted hundreds of interviews, followed thousands of tips, and used advanced forensic techniques to build their case. The TBI's persistence and professionalism had finally paid off, though it had taken years to gather enough evidence to move forward with charges. For the Bobo family, learning about the evidence was a double-edged sword. They were grateful for the thoroughness of the investigation and hopeful that justice would finally be served. But knowing what Holly had endured in her final hours was almost unbearable. The details would haunt them forever, adding new layers to their grief. The legal process moved slowly, as major criminal cases always do. Preliminary hearings, motions, and other procedural matters consumed months, while the families of all involved waited for resolution. The delay was frustrating but necessary to ensure that justice was served properly and completely. September 2014 brought the discovery that the Bobo family had been both expecting and dreading. When hunters stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area near Holiday, Tennessee, the forensic tent that investigators erected over the site became a symbol of finality. After years of hoping against hope that Holly might still be alive somewhere, the DNA confirmation that followed ended all doubt about her fate. The discovery site was remote and well hidden, suggesting that whoever had placed Holly's remains there had chosen the location carefully. The condition of the remains and the forensic evidence found with them would provide investigators with additional clues about what had happened, but the family's focus was on finally being able to lay their daughter to rest. Marie Bobo's collapse upon receiving the news was witnessed by several family friends who had gathered to provide support. The moment when hope officially died was as devastating as Holly's initial disappearance had been. After maintaining faith for so long, accepting the reality of death required a complete restructuring of how the family thought about the future. The community's reaction to the discovery was a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the loss of someone so young and full of promise. Relief that Holly's remains had been found and could be properly buried. The uncertainty had been torture for everyone who cared about the family, and having definitive answers allowed the grieving process to move forward. Local churches began planning memorial services while the family made the difficult decisions about funeral arrangements. Holly's body would finally come home to Parsons, where she belonged. The community that had searched for her so tirelessly would have the opportunity to say goodbye properly. The legal implications of finding Holly's remains were significant. Physical evidence from the discovery site would strengthen the prosecution's case and might provide new leads about exactly what had happened. The defendant's lawyers would have to adjust their strategies now that murder charges were supported by the discovery of a body. The funeral service for Holly Lynn Bobo became one of the largest gatherings in Parsons history. The white casket adorned with pink roses sat at the front of New Hope Baptist Church, surrounded by flowers from across Tennessee and beyond. People who had never met Holly came to pay their respects. Drawn by her story and the family's grace under unimaginable circumstances, Marie Bobo's strength during the service amazed everyone who witnessed it. She spoke about her daughter's dreams of helping others heal, her kindness to everyone she met, and her unshakable faith. Through tears, she thanked the community for never giving up on Holly and for supporting the family through the darkest period of their lives. The hymns chosen for the service reflected Holly's favorite songs, many of which she had sung in the church choir before her death. Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art filled the sanctuary with voices that seemed to lift Holly's spirit toward heaven. The music provided comfort that words alone could not offer. Pastor Steve Neal spoke about Holly's life as a gift to everyone who had known her. He emphasized that while her time on earth had been cut short, her impact would continue through the lives she had touched and the changes her story would inspire. He challenged the congregation to honor Holly's memory by showing the same kindness and compassion she had demonstrated. The graveside service was more intimate, attended by family and close friends who had walked through the valley of grief together. As the casket was lowered into the ground, the silence was profound. Years of uncertainty and anguish were finally being laid to rest alongside Holly's physical remains. Clint Bobo placed the first handful of dirt on his sister's casket, fulfilling a promise he had made to himself to see her properly buried. The simple act represented closure of a sort, though the emotional work of grieving would continue for years to come. The period from 2015 to 2016 was marked by intensive preparation as prosecutors built their case for trial. The prosecutors' case files grew thick with witness statements, forensic evidence, and legal briefs that would form the foundation of their arguments against Zachary Adams and his co-defendants. The thoroughness of this preparation would ultimately determine whether justice could be served. Jason Autry's decision to cooperate with prosecutors represented a major breakthrough in the case. His willingness to testify against his former accomplices provided investigators with an insider's perspective on what had happened to Holly. The cooperation came with a plea agreement that would reduce Autry's own sentence, a fact that defense attorneys would surely challenge during trial. The family struggled with conflicting emotions about Autry's cooperation. They were grateful for information that might help convict the other defendants, but they also felt disgust toward a man who had participated in their daughter's murder. The complexity of the justice system meant accepting help from people they considered monsters. Witness interviews continued throughout this period, as prosecutors sought to establish a timeline of events and corroborate Autry's testimony with independent evidence. Some witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearing retaliation from associates of the defendants. Others had waited years to share information they had been too frightened to report initially. The legal teams on both sides engaged in extensive motion practice, arguing over what evidence would be admissible at trial and what procedural rules would govern the proceedings. These technical battles happened largely out of public view, but they were crucial to determining how the case would unfold. For the Bobo family, this preparation period was emotionally exhausting. They knew that the trial would force them to relive Holly's disappearance and death in excruciating detail, but they also knew that this was their best opportunity to see justice served and to honor their daughter's memory through the legal system. The court date was finally set for fall 2017, more than 6 years after Holly's disappearance. Fall 2017 brought the moment the Bobo family had been waiting for since that terrible April morning in 2011. The courtroom gallery packed with community members represented years of shared grief and anticipation, neighbors who had searched the woods, fellow church members who had prayed through countless vigils, and strangers who had followed Holly's story, all gathered to witness the pursuit of justice. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a case that was both methodical and emotionally devastating. They described how Zachary Adams had planned Holly's kidnapping, enlisted his cousin Dylan and friend Jason Autry to help, and then carried out a crime that shocked even experienced investigators. The details were presented with clinical precision, but their impact was profound. Jason Autry's testimony provided the most dramatic moments of the trial, taking the witness stand against his former accomplices. He described the conspiracy in chilling detail. His account of Holly's final hours was so disturbing that several jurors appeared visibly shaken. The defense's attempts to discredit him as a liar seeking a reduced sentence seemed weak against the specific details he provided. The physical evidence corroborated much of Autry's testimony. Forensic experts testified about DNA findings, cell phone records, and other technical evidence that supported the prosecution's timeline. The scientific evidence provided an objective foundation for the more emotional testimony from witnesses and family members. Holly's family sat in the front row throughout the trial, their presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. Marie Bobo's quiet dignity impressed court observers who watched her maintain composure even during the most difficult testimony. Her strength seemed to inspire everyone in the courtroom to treat the proceedings with the gravity they deserved. The defense team's strategy focused on challenging the credibility of Autry's testimony and arguing that the physical evidence was circumstantial. They painted their client as a scapegoat for a crime he hadn't committed, but their argument seemed to gain little traction with the jury. The moment when the jury foreman stood to read the verdict felt like the culmination of 6 and 1/2 years of anguish and hope. The judge's gavel that would soon fall represented more than legal procedure. It represented the sound of justice finally being served for Holly Lynn Bobo. The courtroom was completely silent as everyone waited to hear whether their faith in the legal system had been justified. Guilty of first-degree murder, the foreman announced, his voice carrying across a room that seemed to exhale collectively. Guilty of especially aggravated kidnapping. Guilty of aggravated sexual battery. Each count brought a new wave of emotion from Holly's family and supporters. Tears of relief mixed with grief that nothing could truly repair their loss. Zachary Adams showed no visible reaction to the verdicts, maintaining the same cold demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. His lack of remorse only reinforced the jury's decision and the community's belief that justice had been served. The man who had destroyed so many lives seemed incapable of understanding the magnitude of his crimes. The sentencing that brought even more emotion as family members were given the opportunity to address the court. Marie Bobo spoke directly to Adams, describing the pain his actions had caused and the daughter he had stolen from the world. Her words were measured but powerful, representing not just personal grief but the voice of everyone who had loved Holly. When Judge Don Ash announced the sentence, life without parole plus 50 years, the finality was both satisfying and sobering. Adams would never have another opportunity to harm anyone, but Holly would never come home. Justice had been served, but it couldn't resurrect the dead or heal all wounds. The family's exhale of grief and relief was audible throughout the courtroom. They had fought for this moment for years, and now it was finally here. The verdict wouldn't bring Holly back, but it honored her memory and ensured that her killer would never hurt anyone else. Late 2017 found the Bobo family grappling with the complex emotions that followed Zachary Adams' conviction. The news headlines proclaiming justice served represented the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another difficult journey. Processing the verdict required accepting that their legal fight was largely over, while their emotional healing was just beginning. Media interviews in the aftermath of the trial gave the family opportunities to speak about Holly's life rather than just her death. They shared memories of her laughter, her dreams of helping others, and her unwavering faith. These interviews helped shift the narrative from victim to someone whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of her death. The community's response to the verdict was overwhelmingly positive, with many residents expressing relief that justice had finally been served. Some had worried that the case was too old or the evidence too circumstantial to secure a conviction. The guilty verdict restored faith in the legal system and provided a sense of closure for the entire town. A candlelight vigil held a few weeks after the trial drew hundreds of participants who gathered to celebrate Holly's life and the successful conclusion of the legal proceedings. The soft glow of candles illuminated faces that had aged noticeably during the 6-year ordeal, marking the passage of time and the weight of shared grief. For Marie Bobo, the period after the trial was marked by a strange sense of emptiness. The fight for justice had given her life structure and purpose during the darkest period. Now that the fight was over, she had to find new ways to honor Holly's memory and give meaning to her own continued existence. The family began considering ways to establish a more permanent memorial to Holly, something that would help other families facing similar tragedies. They wanted Holly's legacy to include positive change, not just the successful prosecution of her killers. 2018 brought the sentencing of Dylan Adams, whose plea agreement resulted in a 15-year prison term for his role in Holly's murder. The plea agreement documents revealed the extent of his cooperation with investigators and his admission of guilt for participating in the conspiracy. His sentence was significantly lighter than his cousin's, reflecting both his lesser role and his cooperation with authorities. For the Bobo family, Dylan's plea provided some additional answers about what had happened to Holly, but it also reopened wounds that had begun to heal. Learning new details about their daughter's ordeal was always difficult, regardless of the context. They were grateful that Dylan had accepted responsibility, but they still felt hollow when contemplating the lives that had been destroyed. The plea hearing was less dramatic than Zachary Adams' trial had been, but it still required the family to face one of Holly's killers in court. Dylan's expression showed more remorse than his cousin had ever displayed, though the family questioned whether it was genuine regret or simply fear of a harsher sentence. Community reaction to Dylan's plea was mixed. Some felt that 15 years was too lenient for someone who had participated in such a horrific crime. Others argued that his cooperation had been essential to securing Zachary Adams' conviction and that the plea agreement was a necessary compromise. The legal system's complexity often frustrated people who wanted clear-cut justice, but prosecutors explained that plea agreements were tools that helped ensure the worst offenders received the harshest punishments. Without Dylan's cooperation and Autry's testimony, convicting Zachary Adams might have been impossible. The family attended the hearing but said little to the media afterward. They were exhausted by years of legal proceedings and ready to focus on healing rather than punishment. Justice was important, but it couldn't restore what they had lost or undo the pain they had endured. By 2020, Jason Autry's turn to face formal sentencing arrived, marking another milestone in the long legal journey. The court transcript of Autry's testimony during Zachary Adams's trial had become a crucial document in understanding the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost Holly her life. His decision to testify had been motivated by his own plea agreement, but it had also provided the detailed account that made the other convictions possible. Autry's guilty plea included admissions that chilled everyone who heard them. He described his role in the kidnapping and murder with a matter-of-fact tone that seemed to minimize the horror of what he had done. His lack of emotion while recounting Holly's final hours demonstrated the callousness that had made the crime possible in the first place. The courtroom atmosphere during Autry's sentencing was different from the earlier proceedings. There was less media attention and fewer spectators, perhaps because the community felt that justice had already been served with Adams' conviction. But for the Bobo family, each legal milestone was significant in the ongoing process of seeking accountability. Whispers of betrayal filled the courtroom as Autry's cooperation with prosecutors was discussed. Some viewed him as someone who had found conscience and courage to do the right thing, even late. Others saw him as a coward who had participated in murder and then tried to save himself by betraying his accomplices. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the complexity of Autry's role. While his cooperation had been valuable to the prosecution, he had also participated in one of the most heinous crimes in Tennessee's recent history. Balancing these factors required careful consideration of justice, deterrence, and the need for truth. For Holly's family, Autry represented both a source of answers and a reminder of their daughter's suffering. His testimony had helped convict Zachary Adams, but he had also been present during Holly's worst moments. The family's feelings toward him remained complicated and painful. The months following the final legal proceedings found Parsons confronting the darkness that had existed in their midst for years. The church healing service program distributed throughout the community reflected a desire to move forward while acknowledging the trauma that had affected everyone. Churches-led services focused on forgiveness, healing, and the hope that light could overcome even the deepest darkness. Pastor Steve Neal often spoke about the challenge of maintaining faith in the face of such evil. How could a loving God allow someone like Holly to suffer and die? How could a community that prided itself on Christian values produce men capable of such cruelty? These questions didn't have easy answers, but the pastor argued that asking them was part of the healing process. The community's response to the revelation of evil in their midst varied considerably. Some residents felt betrayed by neighbors who had kept secrets for years. Others wondered what signs they might have missed that could have prevented Holly's death. The self-reflection was painful but necessary for moving forward. Support groups formed to help residents process their trauma and grief. The realization that multiple local men had conspired to commit murder had shattered assumptions about small-town safety and neighborly trust. Rebuilding those foundations required acknowledging that evil could exist anywhere, even in places that seemed safest. Children who had grown up during the years of investigation were particularly affected by the revelations. Many had been sheltered from the worst details, but they still absorbed the fear and uncertainty that had permeated their community. Parents struggled with how much to explain and how to restore their children's sense of security. The healing services emphasized Holly's life and character, rather than focusing on her killers. Community leaders wanted her legacy to be about the good she had done and the positive changes her story had inspired, not just about the evil that had destroyed her. In 2021, Marie Bobo channeled her grief into service, volunteering with organizations that supported other families dealing with missing persons cases. The fresh flowers she regularly placed on Holly's grave had become a symbol of love that transcends death. But her work with other grieving families represented hope that something positive could emerge from tragedy. Marie's transformation from victim to advocate inspired many people who had followed Holly's story. Her willingness to relive her own trauma to help others demonstrated a strength that seemed almost superhuman. She spoke at conferences, testified before legislators, and counseled old families who were just beginning their own nightmare journeys. The other families Marie worked with came from all backgrounds and circumstances, but they shared the common experience of having a loved one vanish without explanation. Some cases were resolved quickly. Others remained unsolved for decades. Marie's role was to provide support and hope during the darkest periods of uncertainty. Her advocacy work focused on improving communication between law enforcement agencies, faster implementation of search protocols, and better support services for families. She argued that Holly's case had taught valuable lessons about the importance of persistence and community involvement in solving complex crimes. The healing work was emotionally exhausting, requiring Marie to confront her own trauma repeatedly while helping others process theirs. But she found purpose in the belief that Holly's story could prevent other families from enduring similar orals, or at least help them navigate the process more effectively. Dana and Clint supported Marie's advocacy work while finding their own ways to honor Holly's memory. Dana contributed to search efforts for other missing persons using skills he had learned. During the years of looking for Holly, Clint spoke to young men about recognizing dangerous situations and protecting the people they loved. The family's decision to turn their pain into service reflected the values Holly had embodied during her short life. The 2022 anniversary of Holly's disappearance brought a memorial walk that demonstrated how her story had touched lives far beyond Parsons, Tennessee. The memorial walk route map showed a path through the town that connected significant locations from Holly's life, her family's church, her high school, the nursing program she had loved. Hundreds of participants followed the route, creating a visible reminder of a life that continued to inspire others. Holly's former classmates and friends spoke at the memorial service that concluded the walk. Now adults with careers and families of their own, they reflected on dreams that Holly would never fulfill and achievements she would never celebrate. Many had chosen nursing careers partly inspired by Holly's example, creating a living memorial to her aspirations. The memorial walk also served as a fundraiser for the Holly Bobo Memorial Scholarship, which helped other students pursue nursing education. The scholarship recipients often spoke about the responsibility they felt to honor Holly's memory through their own service to others. These young people represented the continuation of Holly's dream to heal and help others. Community members who participated in the walk ranged from people who had known Holly personally to strangers who had been moved by her story. The diversity of participants demonstrated how her case had resonated with people across different backgrounds and communities. Her story had become larger than her individual life. The walk concluded at the cemetery where Holly was buried, providing participants with an opportunity to pay their respects and reflect on the impact of her life. The gravesite, always decorated with fresh flowers and mementos, had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand how to find meaning in tragedy. Media coverage of the memorial walk focused on Holly's life and legacy, rather than the details of her murder. This shift in emphasis reflected a conscious decision by the community to remember her for who she was rather than how she died. As the years passed, the Bobo family learned to carry their grief alongside their faith, finding ways to live meaningful lives while acknowledging the space that Holly's absence had created. The family photograph with its missing space served as a constant reminder of loss, but also as motivation to live fully in honor of the daughter and sister who no longer could. Small routines anchored them to hope and purpose. Marie continued her advocacy work, finding strength in helping other families navigate similar tragedies. Dana maintained Holly's grave and participated in search efforts for other missing persons. Clint gradually overcame the survivor's guilt that had plagued him for years, learning to remember Holly's life rather than focusing on the moment she disappeared. The family's faith had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but it had ultimately sustained them through the darkest periods. Their church remained a source of comfort and community, providing the support system that made survival possible. The belief that Holly's suffering had ended and that they would be reunited someday gave meaning to their continued existence. Therapy and counseling had helped each family member process trauma in healthy ways. Though the work of healing would continue for the rest of their lives, they had learned that grief doesn't disappear. It transforms into something more manageable that can coexist with joy and hope. The community's support had been essential to their survival, demonstrating the power of people coming together during times of crisis. Neighbors who brought meals, friends who listened without judgment, and strangers who offered prayers had all contributed to the family's ability to endure and eventually find peace. Their story had become an example of how people can survive unimaginable loss while maintaining their values and faith. The strength they demonstrated inspired others facing their own tragedies and showed that light could indeed penetrate even the deepest darkness. In quiet moments of reflection, Clint still recalled that final glimpse of Holly walking toward the woods on April 13, 2011. The image had tormented him for years, but now it carried different meaning. Instead of representing his failure to protect his sister, it had become a symbol of her courage in the face of danger and his own journey toward healing and forgiveness. The memorial candle that burned continuously in Holly's memory had become a focal point for the family's ongoing grief and hope. The flame never flickered or died, maintained by family members who saw it as a physical representation of Holly's enduring presence in their lives. Visitors to the family home often commented on the candle's steady glow and the peace it seemed to provide. Holly's life, though cut tragically short, had inspired countless acts of kindness and service. Nursing students who had never met her carried forward her dream of helping others heal. Families facing their own tragedies found strength in the Bobo family's example of faith under pressure. Community members who had participated in the search efforts continued to volunteer for other causes, having learned the power of collective action. The legal proceedings had provided justice and accountability, but Holly's true legacy lay in the lives she had touched and the positive changes her story had inspired. Her killers would spend their lives in prison, but Holly's influence would continue to grow through the people who remembered her example and chose to honor it through their own actions. The story of Holly Lynn Bobo was ultimately about more than crime and punishment. It was about a family's refusal to let evil have the final word, a community's determination to protect its members, and a young woman's lasting impact on a world that had lost her far too soon. In the steady flame of the memorial candle, her light continued to shine unbroken and eternal.